It's Mike Bielawski with True North Reports TV. This is our last show for 2019. It's getting long in the tooth there. We have a guest today, a repeat guest, David Flemming from the Ethan Allen Institute, and he's the only one that comes in studio, so I'm very happy for that.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, I appreciate that. A lot of our guests are all over the state, but still, it's nice to have a physical presence once in a while. So we have before we get into our topic, which is going to be essentially the carbon tax yet again, or a form of it, I guess you could say, the Transportation, can you finish it? Climate Initiative?
Yes, you got it, I guess.
Got it.
Transportation Climate Initiative.
So many acronyms. Do you want to remind people what you do for the Ethan Allen Institute? You're kind of a policy analyst, right?
That is correct, yes. So I do a lot of the research and writing on our website, ethanallen.org, and I also sit on many of the committee hearings in Montpelier.
Mm-hmm. And I'm a writer with True North Reports. And yeah, I think, as I just mentioned a moment ago, it seems like energy and the cost of energy just continues to be a subject on this show, as it should be, because it's just that's what's going on at the State House. They want to add to the cost of our energy and our fuel to use that money to put it towards, I guess, fighting global warming. So there's yet another strategy to do that. This time they want to include, instead of having just Vermont do it on its own, which would be carbon tax. I think the recent version that we talked about was the Essex Plan. That was a Vermont-specific plan where Vermonters would pay more for their heating oil, more for their gas, more for their electric, and that money would go towards, presumably, saving the environment. But now they want to do it differently. They want to do it as a multi-state initiative with, it was 13 states, although it might actually be 12 now because I think New Hampshire has opted out. But anyway, northeastern states will go in together on what, we'll kind of go back and forth on the show on defining it, but for lack of a better phrase, another form of the carbon tax, I think. And can you explain more about how does it work? We've got, 12 states now. They're looking into it. Has anybody signed on to it yet, officially?
At the moment, I believe it's still a work in progress.
Still a work in progress.
So there are many governors and legislatures that have discussed it in a very positive light. But as of now, it's not a finished product, so they haven't had a chance to sign on to it officially.
But the governor of New Hampshire, Chris Sununu, has announced that they are not going to sign on to it. So one state is out. I guess we'll find out. Vermont has yet to make our decision. The governors make the decision, so this is going to be Phil Scott's decision. So how does it work? It's not a conventional carbon tax, as in like you're the customer, you go to the pump and you pay X amount more per gallon. It's a little bit different, right? It's kind of higher up the food chain, so to speak.
Yes, and that was designed purposely because many of the legislators and bureaucrats, they realized that it'd be very difficult to tax people at the pump. And so their thought was, why don't we tax the wholesalers for whatever gas that they are supplying the retailers and the consumers. And then that will, in a sense, trickle down to the consumer after a series of transactions.
Mm-hmm. So we're talking about taxing the fuel producers, the fuel makers. Now, I'm not an economist by any means, but wouldn't it be safe to say if you tax the producer, you're, for all intents and purposes, taxing the buyers as well?
Yes, though there is a good question of how much will be taxed, because there are some taxes that if you tax a supplier who's further up in the supply chain, then there is a question of how much that tax will reach down to the consumer. That being said, in some ways it resembles a quota in some aspects as opposed to a tax, because rather than putting a fixed added price per gallon, they are actually limiting the number of gallons of gasoline that will be able to be sold in this region of the Northeast.
Mm-hmm. Now, what happens if you go over the quota? Is that where things get interesting, right?
Well, I guess that's a great question, and I don't think there's a necessarily solid answer right now. They are at the moment assuming that all the suppliers will meet the quota, and if not, then they will be penalized
Right.
for doing so. And I believe, well, it really has to do with the whole aspect of an auction, of how that's decided.
Okay, so, and this quote is going to drop incrementally, right? Isn't that how it's?
Yes, and they haven't really decided how much. I believe that they are right now considering 3 options. So the way that it would work at the moment, as I understand it, is that they would set a baseline. So whatever the CO2 emissions are in the first year that this program would be implemented, then from that baseline, you would have incremental reductions on a percent basis every year or every quarter, and it's still not still undecided on that aspect.
Now, if you wanted to avoid paying the fee or the tax if you have to go over, the only answer would be to go elsewhere for your energy, right? Electric cars, maybe. This is centered on transportation, right? We're not talking about...
Right. Well, right. So essentially the whole process for how the program would work as they envisioned it is that they would set this cap, as I was describing, and then there are 3 steps for the program after setting the cap. So that first step would be the auction. And so all of these wholesale gasoline suppliers in the Northeast would get together in a room or perhaps remotely, and they would start a bidding process for how much that they would be willing to pay to have the right to sell that gallon of gasoline. So, and because interesting is that Vermont doesn't really have any wholesale suppliers of gasoline, so we would be still getting our supply from Massachusetts and other states. So it's a little tricky in terms of how the impact of Vermont would be in all of this.
Well, I think the question for a lot of people who just heard that, if we're understanding it correctly, is there any escaping this? Because it almost sounds like if Vermont decided not to do it, according to what you just said, if we're buying our fuel from wholesalers out of state and those states are implementing this, it's almost like this is taken out of our hands.
Perhaps, though it's always interesting to see how markets adapt to work themselves around government regulation, and there are so many instances of this in history. But I can imagine that if New Hampshire backs out of this and a couple other states back out of this, then those states will look like more promising market prospects versus states that have this implemented at the moment. So in some ways, Vermont could be a safe space for wholesale gasoline distributors if other states decide to go with this. I'm not sure if they would go that direction, but perhaps that would be a consideration.
Now New Hampshire is obviously our neighboring state, one of a couple, but do we know how much we're buying from, or if any, energy we're buying from New Hampshire?
I believe most of the gasoline that we're purchasing on wholesale is from Massachusetts, and Massachusetts is one of the leaders in this initiative.
Yeah, I can imagine that. So where do we go from here? There was a report this month, I think, sent back to the governor from his agency of...
Well, let's take a step back here, just so we understand the whole program in its entirety.
Sure.
So just to kind of reiterate things, you have the cap, which I believe Vermont is currently is producing about 6 million tons of CO2 per year. And so we've been out that level for a while now. So then you would have the auction, like I was describing, in which gasoline wholesalers across the Northeast get together. And after that point, then these wholesalers would have certain allowances for the amount of gasoline that they are allowed to sell. And so, but because in order to obtain those allowances at the auction, they will have to pay into a certain set amount of money, and that money will go into a large pot that is viewed by the regulators as a enormous cash flow that they can dip their hands in and dole out to deserving companies and government entities.
Right.
So that's the part where you have the cap and invest, you would essentially have that amount of money which would go towards certain states based on how much they're able to reduce their CO2 output per year. So you have the cap, you have the auction, you have the allowances, and then you have the invest.
Okay.
Those are really the four aspects of this program.
So fundamentally, you go over the cap. You need to pay more to continue to use your gasoline or what have you, your carbon emission producing fuel. You have to pay more if you want to keep doing that. And I think that's the key part of it that people need to know. So what else do people need to know for understanding this program?
Well, I think if you were to contrast it with some of the other ideas for a carbon tax in the past couple of years in Vermont, it's an interesting exercise. So in some ways, the system that we have set up in terms of limiting the quantity of gasoline supplied, it's still a tax in some sense because this money is being generated from wholesalers, which will then be given to these renewable energy folks to innovate and such. But for example, in the Essex Plan, there was more an internal system where it was only based in Vermont, and there were set amounts that would have affected the price. So in year one of the Essex Plan, you would have been taxed, I believe it was 3 cents a gallon, whereas you don't really know how many cents a gallon that you would be taxed under the TCI plan. So in terms of there's some speculation or prediction about what that would be, and I believe it's some amount in the way of anywhere from 1 cent to 6 cents starting off, and then in terms of the TCI, by year 10, rising to as much as 17 cents per gallon of gasoline. And so if you look at it from that perspective, there is a great deal more unpredictability in regards to the TCI versus the Essex Plan, even though they are both carbon taxes.
So taking money from the fuel producers,
Right.
if they go over the cap, it sounds like, if I heard you correctly, this money is going to go to alternative energy sources.
Yes, well, more specifically, I'd say government entities such as the state of Vermont, and they will be getting the money, and then they could choose how it would be used.
But presumably, they would be using this for, I want to say, electric vehicles, probably.
Right.
Maybe a mass transit project. Anything that's not the combustion automobile type of deal.
Right.
But we're also told by the proponents of TCI this is going to be good for the economy, and maybe in the long term that's the way their math adds up.
Right.
But it sounds like this is artificially forcing the market in a direction it wouldn't otherwise go in a free market. I mean, that's the whole purpose of the.
Well, that's the thing is, in some ways we never really had a free market in energy per se, but another way to look at it is we have perhaps a way to see how we're looking at it from. I guess in terms of what I'm trying to say is that the free market in Vermont has never been a real thing, and so we have to look at it as a constant series of regulations, one on top of each other.
Yeah. But this is a new regulation. We're artificially shifting our resources towards something that without this TCI, presumably we would use less of, meaning, renewable forms of transportation.
Yes.
So
yes, I'd say that's accurate.
Have you done a lot of writing or research about the economics of these options they're pushing us towards, the EVs, electric vehicles? I think that's the main thing they're probably pushing, right? Because I don't think mass transportation in Vermont is probably mass transit, I should say, is a big option in Vermont, or maybe they think it is. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways it really depends on which you see as the best alternative to combustion vehicles. And when I was at the State House the past year, it seemed like there was a pretty sizable number of people that were for both options, and I'm not sure which would be one and which would be number two as the alternative. So
Right. I just know I've done a few articles on EVs over the years, and from my understanding, and I know it varies depending on, I think, how many cars the company sold, but there's still like up to $7,500 per vehicle sold that can be given to the customer. I think it's a federal tax credit. Have you heard that? Federal tax credit. Or maybe federal rebate. In any case, federal money, I think that's fair enough to say, that you get. And then once the manufacturer sells X amount of cars, that money gets reduced. But there's that money. And the way I understand it, electric vehicles are still starting around about 30 grand at the low end. If you're getting one of the Teslas, then you're really going up north. So it's just, I feel like that could be a challenge for Vermont.
Yeah,
or the country for that matter.
You're essentially you're really betting on the regulatory environment, because under an unrestricted free market, there's no way these electric vehicles would be an option for really anyone but the rich.
Right.
And if you're counting on those subsidies and those rebates, you're really hoping that the rest of the economy can do well enough where you can actually gather that money from the tax base. And in the past 10 years, we've been in a booming economy relatively, and we've been able to get quite a lot of money for these green alternatives. But in the next 2 years, I'm not so certain we'll be seeing those boom times in terms of how much money we're able to divert from the economy at large to these green initiatives. And if that's the case, especially in Vermont, then we will see just an impracticability where we'll have to be spending more money on our teacher pensions, and we'll be having to cut corners on these green initiatives that we're talking about.
And there's other challenges too. I saw a headline, I actually just pulled it up, over the holiday on Thanksgiving, and this may well happen again on Christmas. I think it was out in California. There's still not enough charging stations. So what happened was you had everybody, of course, on the holidays, they travel to go see their families, and the wait at the charging stations for these electric cars was like, it was like hours. I have an article on thedrive.com. It says more Teslas on the road mean hours-long supercharge lines over Thanksgiving. And then there's some more articles about the same thing. So it's not just new cars, it's new infrastructure. This is a real shift in the way we do transportation. And those are going to cost too, because these I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but there's a reason they're not everywhere. They cost money. Communities need to build these things. So that's another challenge. So what else has your research revealed about TCI?
Well, I think that the shift in green initiatives and toward in our Vermont economy, and how we're looking at these things in an ever growing government regulation for the most basic necessities, such as transportation fuel, because we're such a rural state. I think that the people in the city, and we're pretty well represented, I'd say, overall. In terms of in Burlington, we've got 6 of the senators of our 30 senators being able to vote for initiatives, which may be not super noticeable for the folks in Burlington, but for the folks in rural Vermont and southern Vermont, they're going to be the ones that are going to be hardest hit by these initiatives, because they're going to be the ones who are going to see these price increases at the gas station. So I think that's one important thing to look at.
Yeah, and if they try to get the electric car, now you're talking about driving one of these things in very cold weather. It is quite cold out today. I don't know the exact temperature, but my understanding is the batteries, if you've ever taken anything battery operated outside, I know my remote garage door operator, it doesn't work when I try to use it early in the morning, because it's freezing cold. Of course, if I brought it in my house, that would solve that. But same thing with car batteries. They don't perform as well, or they're not as efficient, I think, in the bitter cold. So there's all kinds of challenges. It's not just economics that go with these cars. And the batteries themselves are made out of I I think it's called cobalt, or
Right.
right, and that's got its own controversies because of the way that it's mined and so forth. So this is a pretty big shift for all these different reasons. And so we got about 8 minutes left. So the governor has to make a decision, and Sununu, the governor of New Hampshire, said no, he's not going to join. Here's where I think it gets interesting, because we are being told that this is almost like a foregone conclusion for Vermont by the advocates. I can't remember who said it, but it's going to be our banner bill, Chris Pearson said, the senator.
Right.
This is going to be our banner bill this year. So according to the proponents in the State House, this is like a done deal. But I asked Governor Scott at a press conference, it was about a month ago, hey, are you going to sign this? And I pointed out that in his 2016 campaign, he was very critical of his Democratic opponent, Sue Minter, because she was openly endorsing a TCI-ish program from 2 or 3 years ago. Same idea, a multi-state initiative. Is that this, or was that something different, or do you not know? Do you know what I'm talking about?
So this is essentially the third carbon tax that Vermont has been looking at over the past 5 years.
Okay.
So I believe that the one that Scott was talking about with Minter was the first iteration of the carbon tax.
Okay. But that was also a multi-state one.
That was before I came to Vermont. I was
Okay.
still in Michigan, so I
Right.
can't say for sure.
Okay. Well, I spoke with some of my other colleagues about it, and my understanding is that was also a multi-state initiative, just like this one. And in Scott's own words, Governor Scott's own words, he was calling it a carbon tax.
Right.
In his opinion, that was his analysis, not mine. And so I put it to him at the press conference. I said, well, you were critical of it then. Are you going to sign it now? And he said, no, I won't, not if it's a carbon tax. And then just to double down, I said, well, what if it comes in a different form, like a cap and trade type thing, or cap and invest, same concept. And he said, I will not sign it if it resembles a carbon tax. So I thought he was pretty clear about that. But I guess we'll find out soon, because the other lawmakers in the State House seem to be on a different page.
Right.
So he's going to have to make that decision, and it's an election year, so there's that. But I remember that was a big cornerstone of his campaign in 2016, was no carbon tax for me. He also said no gun bills, and I think some of our readers might remind that didn't quite work out that way. But so what do you think? I know the Ethan Allen Institute doesn't do a lot of commentary, but what do you think the wind? Where do you think the wind is going here? Do you have any ideas?
Well, I think there are really two opposing forces at the moment, and I think that in areas in the cities of Vermont, there is this great push for green energy. Well, and in the rural areas of Vermont, there is this push for affordability, because the jobs really aren't there as they are in Burlington and other areas of the state. And so I think all Vermonters care about the environment, and I also think many Vermonters care about affordability. And so long as we're willing to balance those two, I think we can get a good outcome. But whenever we decide that we're going to go all in on the environment, affordability is definitely going to suffer.
Yeah, it's almost like, I forgot the phrase, you hear it in sports sometimes, like an unstoppable force meets an immovable wall or something like that. Scott has, to his credit, he put up a couple of fights already on the economy when it comes to raising taxes. So that's your immovable, or almost immovable, depending on who you talk to, that's that position. And then on the other side, you have the Green Caucus and those politicians and activists, and they are pretty set on this one. I mean, they were also pretty set on the Essex bill, and that didn't happen. So, but I think another thing important to keep in perspective is not everybody's predicting that the world's got 10 years before we're doomed. I don't know if I mentioned it on this show, but I've certainly put it in my articles. 500 experts and scientists wrote a joint letter to the United Nations this year, basically complaining that these are people who are not on the position that we're facing a doomsday scenario, They said they're not getting a voice at the table. The science is becoming very political. And they also went on in this letter to say that some of the solutions being proposed, the carbon tax being one of them, are going to be quite damaging. Now, this is all in the letter that people can look up. It's if you just look into a search engine, 500 experts write to the UN about climate change, you'll get that letter and you can read it. But I just think it's important to put out there that not everybody is on that. If we don't do this now, we're all not having a future in 10 years. That's not a universal accepted position, even though a lot of people talk like it is.
Right.
So just putting that out there. So we just got a few minutes left. Is the Ethan Allen Institute, you guys take a break, right?
We do, yes, for Christmas.
Nice. You traveling? You going anywhere? What are you doing?
Staying in Vermont. That's the plan. So
yep.
Nice quiet Christmas.
Okay. Well, myself, I'm going to be also staying in Vermont. We have a 3-week-old baby Yule, a boy.
Oh, that's great.
And,
wow.
So that we're not going very far.
That'll be a handful, I'm sure.
Yeah. No, I had an article due the other day, one of my last ones for the year, and I ended up just holding a baby for like 4 hours straight. It was cute, but at the same time challenging. I'm trying to type one-handed here. Didn't quite work out. Do you find it's easy to unplug from this stuff? You know, this is our careers. We both kind of, you as a policy analyst, me as a writer, we're always sort of engaged in the news. Do you find it easy to unplug and kind of unwind when it's time to do that?
Well, I think that it's hard. I suppose that's a good way to look at it, and you really have to be disciplined in terms of where your priorities are, and looking at work as one priority, and looking at your sanity as another priority. And if you digest too much of this stuff, you'll probably lose part of your sanity. So
that I've been meaning to ask you that question. I was going to ask it at the beginning of the show, but I may as well ask it now. You do kind of keep a calm demeanor about this stuff. I tend to get, I think, sometimes too excited, but it's
right.
It can be upsetting, and neither of us are supposed to be opinion writers anyway, but we do live and breathe in this stuff, basically 24/7 when we're in the middle of work. And some of it can be upsetting if you feel like Vermonters or just people in general are being treated unfairly on any issue. It can be like, it kind of drives you nuts a little bit.
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, the way I look at it is you operate as if 95% of the time you're right, and there's always that's 5% of the time where there could be something you didn't think about, and so that kind of helps you become. If you think something is so obvious, then you may want to hesitate before you start speaking about it, because every now and then you might be wrong.
Yeah,
and that I think it is a way that we can really advance in a society, is if we have that hesitation before we speak, and I think that can do a lot of good in our politicized environment.
Yeah, it is getting very politicized. We got obviously an election year, the whole President Trump thing. I mean, just going home for holidays. I don't know about your family. A lot of my family thinks very differently than I do. So politics is off the table, or I leave the table if it comes up. But as far as getting things wrong or not, I mean, none of us know it all. I know I care about the environment. I certainly want my newborn and my children to grow up in a safe and clean environment. I just think we have to have balance. I mean, if you go too far, we're going to know to wrap it up here. In any case, if you go too far in one direction or the other, it gets too crazy. But anyway, I'm Mike Bielawski with True North Reports. And would you like to say anything? David Flemming with the Ethan Allen Institute.
Well, thanks for having me, Mike. I really appreciate it.
Okay.